morning, everyone. This is Pat McParlin from Opus. Welcome to our webinar, Strategic Third-Party Management in Life Sciences, presented by Opus and Grant Thornton. We're very excited to have a distinguished panel with us this morning. I'll introduce them to you in just a second. Our keynote speaker is Lisa Walkush from Grant Thornton, and will be followed by a panel of Opus and Grant Thornton experts to talk about the many issues surrounding third-party risk management in life sciences, and encourage you to ask questions during the session as well as during the panel. So let's take a look at these speakers and talk a little bit about them. So our first speaker and our keynote is Lisa Walkush, who is the National Life Sciences Industry Leader at Grant Thornton. She's a principal in Grant Thornton's advisory practice and the Sector National Leader for the Life Sciences Industry at Grant Thornton. She has expertise in providing business leadership, transformation and change management, operation excellence, compliance validation, and technology consulting services. She's helped numerous clients in the life sciences industry successfully execute various business processes and technology projects. She's a life sciences and third-party risk management expert, and we are excited to have her today. Welcome, Lisa. Our next panelist is Vic Ray, and Vic is a cyber risk director at Grant Thornton. He has over 14 years of experience in information security, IT risk management, governance, risk and compliance, strategy, technology, selection, implementation, and he has successfully led and managed over 100 cyber engagements from security enhancement initiatives to large security transformation programs, and he is an expert in cyber risk, especially in third-party risk management as it pertains to life sciences. So welcome, Vic. Our third panelist is Adam Schrock, and Adam Schrock is a managing director at Grant Thornton in the risk advisory services area. Prior to joining Grant Thornton, Adam was a director of GRC services at Edgil Adam, and he also served as vice president of third-party risk at American Express, where he ran a global team responsible for managing risk throughout the third-party lifecycle. He also worked at a Big Four with responsibility for delivering information technology GRC for a variety of related services across financial services organizations. And last, we have our moderator, Mark. Last but not least, we have our moderator, Mark DeLuca, the head of global sales here at Opus, and he will lead the panel and introduce our talk here. He has vast experience in enterprise software, third-party risk. He's been at Opus and Hyperos before that for more than 7 years, and has global experience in third-party risk. Prior to Hyperos, he worked at Aravo, also Accenture, ADP, and a number of other organizations. So you're in good hands with this panel and a great moderator in Mark. So let me turn it over to Mark.
Good. So let's start off, Pat. I've got a few slides to just give a little context to Lisa's keynote presentation that'll come up in a minute. First, a little bit on the landscape of life sciences. This group we call life sciences is actually fairly diverse. It breaks into a number of sectors, but you have manufacturers within which biotech and pharma manufacturers really are quite different than med devices. We have healthcare providers, insurers, wholesalers, government organizations. The list goes on. So I just wanted to give some context to this thing we're calling life sciences. It does not necessarily mean a tier one pharmaceutical manufacturer. It is fairly large and broad, and the needs within each are different. And the third parties that they work with are different as well. So we have, your typical third-party intermediaries, which are really big in the med device space, contract manufacturers, which are obviously big in the pharmaceutical manufacturers, healthcare providers, traditional vendors or suppliers, insurers, CROs for those that do research, the big drug distributors, which are very important third parties, these intermediaries that do sales, sales agent intermediaries, and all of these have subcontractors, or what we often refer to as fourth or end parties. And that's important because those subcontractors are often the source of a great deal of the risk that that our clients in the life sciences space deal with. And those clients span multiple areas of the firm. And this is part of today's topic, is this concept of reaching across the aisle, sharing information, doing things together internally. So we have these constituents to the third-party management process that are all driven by separate things. So you have the folks in procurement, we have supply chain, which are more about manufacturing, InfoSec or information security, and data privacy. Obviously, we know what they're interested in terms of third-party management, legal, commercial, and managed markets. So all of these constituents within the four walls of your firm all draw upon third parties, all manage risk a little bit differently, but in many ways are performing a similar business process on a similar and sometimes the same third party. So the risks that they have to collaborate on are fairly diverse as well. So they're from different parts of the firm. They have different charters, but also the risks that they manage are a little bit different. The one at the top, called identification, or what many of you call MDM or master data management, is probably the biggest out of all of them, which is, how do I figure out who all the third parties are that we do business with and uniquely identify them so that there's one. So if I happen to have 12 instances of SAP across the globe, I can look at a third party and look at a single golden record that electronically ties out to all the records within SAP as well as other systems in the firm. And that can be really important. And the reason that's important is I'm beginning with this concept of managing risk from the top of the funnel. I look at everything first and then kind of segment down to the third parties that represent risk in the domain for which I'm responsible. Common thing we see is to start sort of down in the funnel with third parties that I know expose us to risk, and then some get missed at the top of the funnel, and invariably that's where the risk comes from. But that identification one is important. You can see the other ones. Our CISO is interested in an InfoSec breach. Everybody is interested in these subagents and fourth parties and subcontractors. Our procurement folks and manufacturing folks are interested in generalized, what I'd call supplier risk. The compliance office will want due diligence documented. They're going to want to manage reputational risk, sanctions, negative news, political exposure, state ownership, that sort of thing. Data protection and data privacy obviously is very big in life sciences, and so on. So you can see that the risks that we have to manage are fairly diverse. So with that context, I'll pass the floor over to Lisa to take us through a keynote presentation.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Sure.
So I'd like to take this opportunity just to share with everyone some of the industry trends that we've been seeing in life sciences around third-party risk management. So again, as Mark set the stage very nicely here, there is a growing use of third parties in this industry. And again, it's due to a number of different reasons, but a lot of it is just how a lot of the companies in this industry are growing, innovating, partnering, and the whole landscape and ecosystem continues to evolve and change. There's also the trend towards continuing to outsource a number of different functional areas, such as manufacturing, obviously clinical trials. So with that, there's a whole ecosystem of third parties that you have to deal with. Also, the auditors and regulators continue to look at third parties as a major risk area. So again, as an organization, you do need to be able to identify those risks, really come up with a solid way to measure the risks, kind of bubble up those risks that are really the ones that you should be focusing in on, and making sure that you have a way to remediate, monitor, and measure them. I think Mark brought up a really good point. What we've seen at a lot of our clients and a lot of the companies in life sciences, the approach that is typically taken is this bottom-up approach instead of a top-down approach. So we will talk today about the opportunity of really looking at third-party risk management at the enterprise level and trying to look at it more from a strategic perspective and kind of stepping outside of your silo. So if you're in compliance, I should really be talking more with procurement. And is there an opportunity for us to really look at the top of the funnel and all of the third parties that we're working with? Obviously, protecting patient and consumer information is huge. So the data breaches that we've seen in the news lately, there's reputational risk, financial damage that can happen from these breaches. So making sure that you understand who has access to any patient information, within your organization, and also as you're engaging with these third parties, what data do they have? So we're going to talk a lot about, knowing your third party and what types of information they have access to. In addition to that, there's obviously GDPR coming into play. So that's going to be just something else that, from a third-party risk management perspective that, you need to be thinking about, and thinking about how that's going to impact certain things like people in Europe that may opt into one of your clinical trials. What if they decide to opt out? So how are you going to ensure that you have their data? So there's things like that you need to think about. Also with the transparency reporting requirements in Europe, what do you need to do as you're capturing that information from healthcare professionals now under GDPR? You're going to have to get their consent to get that information. So there's, again, this changing landscape with the regulatory requirements and also the expansion. And the fourth thing that we really wanted to mention is just the continued M&A activity. Actually, when Mark got here, there was another acquisition, big one that was announced today. And with the continued M&A activity, this does pose a challenge for organizations as you're going through that integration process and due diligence process to really understand this company that we're acquiring, what third parties are they using, how are we going to get all that information together, do we know the whole universe of third parties, how are you vetting them, managing them. So again, I think with that M&A activity, which again, we don't see any signs of that slowing down, it's something to just continue to think about. So we're also hearing some things from our clients around, that the cost of complying with some of these things is becoming an issue. So, is there an opportunity to try and think about this in a different way so we can manage these costs? Also with the due diligence requirements, again, you have to understand those risks and what are we doing to vet, measure, and manage them. And then, again, just, the impacts on how we're working with and managing our third parties. We wanted to share just a couple of stats from a survey. So, here are some stats that really support why the regulators are really focusing in on third-party risk management. So I won't go and read these. Everyone can take a look at them. I think one that I will point out, and Vic is going to take the opportunity to talk about this in a little while, but 68% of third-party threat landscape is expanding. And the reason for that is more of our applications are going into the cloud. So I think with that, it presents some other things that we have to think about to manage third parties, particularly from a data privacy and cybersecurity perspective. So we wanted to just take a minute to really talk about, the need to work with third parties. And again, within your organization, how you have to balance that with obviously innovation and growth. So, at the end of the day, in this industry, everybody's talking about innovation. How can we innovate? People are looking at a number of different ways to approach innovation, whether it's new product development, whether it is strategic partnerships, whether it's, going towards using apps and different technology. So, that that has to continue, and it cannot be slowed down to make sure that this industry continues to grow, and more importantly, that we're doing the right thing for patients. So innovation is a huge, huge part of that. So your organization has to be able to do that. Now, with that, we have to balance the use of third parties and reaching out to people that may have expertise in certain areas. So again, in this day and age, partnering, reaching out to people that have expertise in certain areas, leveraging their knowledge, will continue. So, and it should continue. So it's really balancing, pulling everyone together to make sure that you can drive innovation and growth with managing the risk. So we're going to take a couple minutes and just walk through kind of 5 steps to prepare your organization for effective third-party risk management. And we won't take too much time on each point, but we'll just walk through them at a high level. So we'll talk a little bit about knowing your data, talk about how you perform risk assessments. I think that uplift or even looking at your contracts is very important. So there's a couple of key things that we believe you should be thinking about as you contractually enter into arrangements with these third parties. And then we'll talk about ongoing how to manage your risk from a monitoring perspective. I think the one thing we can talk about there is there's a lot of use of analytics now and AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, things that you can do to really help from a monitoring perspective and managing that risk as you move forward. And then finally, we do want to spend a couple minutes talking about collaboration. So we really think that there is this opportunity to look at risk more from a top-down perspective and, really bring the different parts of your organization together to look at third-party risk management and to figure out a way to improve how you're managing that risk, and then also how can you reduce cost. So the first one, again, just knowing your data. This is something that again, I think we think is so basic, but what we find when we go out and talk to clients and different organizations in life sciences will ask, the simple question around how many third parties do you have? And
people squirm in their seats when you ask that question.
Or it's, well, I think I have this amount. And then when you start to ask a couple more questions around, so it might just be compliance, how many third parties do we have? Then you go to procurement. It's something totally different. But then you go and talk to the commercial organization. Oh my gosh, yes, that's right, we have HCPs. So all of a sudden that, call it 2,000 becomes 5. So I think really, bringing people together and understanding who you're engaging with from a third-party perspective with the lens of these are different types of relationships, and they could be performing business on your behalf. They could be providing a service. So all of that is fine, but it's really trying to get a solid understanding of who are you engaging with, what data are they accessing from your organization, and then, again, contractually, what are their obligations? So, and what type of risk are they presenting to your organization, and also, any patients, and how are we managing that? So that's kind of step 1. You guys want to add anything?
Yeah. I just want to add one quick thing, Lisa. I think this is a great point, and I see a lot of this components of this spread out in various parts of the organization. So, for example, I was at one of my clients where we were evaluating them on a broader cybersecurity sort of domains, and obviously one of them was how do you manage your supplier risk, right? So when it came to that, a lot of the processes were defined at a corporate level, but when you look down at a business level, that's where they weren't really aware of what their vendor tier was.
Yeah.
They had an approved set of vendor lists. That means that anytime they needed to develop a new product or write a new piece of code, they had an approved vendor list, but when we started drilling that down further to ask them, well, if you evaluated those approved vendor list, approved AVL as they call it, right? Did you understand what type of services are they providing? Do you know where your data is and which third parties or even downstream entities, for that matter, are in some way touching sensitive data that you may be collecting? They didn't really have that visibility, and they were able to point that back to the corporate, but the corporate looks at it in a very broad manner. The second thing is, and I know there are the whole phase of the supplier risk management is covered in the following slides, but this is essentially knowing your data can really help you figure out what controls need to be put in place before you start engaging with your providers.
Yep. And I just want to build on that a little bit, because I know, Vic, we were talking about this earlier, and it leads to, again, software as a medical device, the use of apps and technology is huge. So what we're seeing is, our clients engaging with third parties to innovate and develop these products, which is fantastic. Where I think some of our clients are struggling is, how do we bring in compliance and the
by design.
Third party? Yes, by design. So not just okay, we have this great new product, and then, oh my gosh, we're getting ready to, I don't want to say launch it, but we're getting towards the end of the development cycle, and then it's, oh my gosh, we didn't have kind of all the appropriate people involved in the, again, in the design that we should have.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I would say the other aspect of knowing your third party is, and I think the questions on this slide would indicate, do I have good insight into the nature of my relationship with this third party? I think the other danger we run into is that we find pockets of third parties that are outside of the scope of whatever vetting the life sciences firm is doing.
Right.
And I learned this years ago with a large UK life sciences firm. They had a big footprint in Delaware. We're working with them on a supplier risk initiative, and there were something like 25,000 of those, and we thought we had them all.
Right.
And they were with us about a year, and one of the gentlemen did a whiteboard on their third parties and said, well, these are just our supply chain providers. There are also HCPs, and then there was this other segment of these marketing firms that they dealt with, which were just, in their minds, outside of the scope of what we were dealing with. So you can find pockets of third parties that expose you to risk if you're not careful.
Yep. And actually, if we can go to the next slide, because that's a great segue into the next piece. So the next thing that we want to talk about is just, again, understanding third parties and how you're conducting risk assessments. So, Mark, I think you just brought up a great point, and we've actually done this again with some clients, and we've seen this at a number of the organizations in life sciences. But when you're trying to look at third-party risk and who you're engaging with, going through that whiteboard exercise of, okay, let's pick a process. And again, there might be some preconceived idea of how many third parties we're engaging with, but when you go through and step-by-step walk through that process, all of a sudden, you're finding different third parties, pockets of third parties that you referred to that you're engaging with in the process. So it's a great exercise to go through and then, again, get that broader list of third parties that you're engaging with. And again, understanding how you're engaging with them, and then really figuring out, okay, how do we need to really assess this risk? So, and then once you do that, we typically do an initial risk assessment on those third parties that may lead to more due diligence, again, based on how you're engaging with them. I'm sure everyone's aware of that. So we're going to move on to just talking about contracts. So I think, again, we really believe that there's an opportunity here to take a look at how you're contractually engaging with and the obligations that you have when you're bringing in a third party to do business on your behalf or provide a service. So from a risk perspective, there's obvious things that we always recommend that you include in those contracts, the right to audit, et cetera. I think the one thing that you do need to think about is when you're engaging with these third parties, if they are engaging with third parties, you need to make sure that there's various flow down clauses and that they are holding the fourth party accountable for everything that you are holding the third party accountable for. So I don't know, Vic, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Lisa. I think that's another area that we strongly encourage our clients to kind of pay special attention to, primarily because one thing is that depending on the nature of services that a third parties are providing, you may or you should at least have a process in place to say, okay, well, if they're accessing health data or patient data or any sensitive data that includes name, email addresses, home addresses, and things like that, the confidentiality of the data changes by time. So it could mean that if a person is going through, let's say, a legal lawsuit and they do not want to disclose their home address, and that's in some way or form captured in a database somewhere, they're accountable to make sure that that information does not get leaked out, right? So the confidentiality also changes over time, and that, in the sense, means that you need to have a contract management process that looks at various security controls in place that should be put in place. And then if that third party is further engaging with a downstream entity or a fourth party, how do you ensure that those contractual clauses are passed down and include those in the contract reviews that the third party should be responsible for? Right. Eventually, there needs to be a good coordination between the process, especially when it goes downstream. But I think that's an area that needs a lot of attention or working together of different groups and ensuring that, yes, you know what, they're basically responsible and this is being managed. So we encourage our clients to do that, but as you mentioned earlier, Lisa, that's certainly something that could be enforced down in the contract in the first place. And so to work with compliance or to work with legal will certainly help in kind of ensuring that that process is defined and followed.
And I think,
and Vic, I'm
go ahead, Adam.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to mention. I think this is a big thing that a lot of our clients right now are struggling with, just because as the risk landscape has increased, and especially our global clients that are dealing with GDPR, a lot of the contract templates that have been historically used don't adequately cover the information security requirements that we're putting on our third parties, as well as the privacy requirements. So, a lot of our clients are just struggling if, they need to go back and actually renegotiate these contracts and add those clauses in. Most of our clients are actually kind of defaulting to, when they renew, they're going to update the language. But for some of the greenfield contracts where you may have those long-term contracts with third parties that may be 10 years before they expire, they are taking the initiative to renegotiate some of those service agreements and put the proper clauses in from a security and privacy perspective.
Yeah, just one more point on that. I think we've learned from other industries that have gone down this path ahead of life sciences. It's not just enough to flow down contract provisions to the third party, but they have to check.
Yes.
So I think they have to show that they are diligent, at least in some sort of a reasonability check or a process audit, to show that their third party is in effect managing its third party relationships. Right. Because if I'm, J&J or Merck, I can't be in the business of managing fifth, sixth, seventh, third parties. Exactly. There just aren't enough people in the company.
Absolutely. So another great segue into our next topic, which is around risk-based ongoing monitoring. So thank you, Mark, for that. But again, just the fourth step in preparing for effective third-party risk is really looking at how you're monitoring this risk on an ongoing basis. So I think there's been what we've seen, some great advances in this area with the use of analytics. So we've seen at a number of life sciences clients the use of analytics to actually look at the third parties that you are monitoring on an ongoing basis, but also to really apply different attributes, algorithms to transactions to really identify those transactions that may be outliers and to help you hone in on that third party that you really should be looking at. So, we are seeing a lot of progress in that area. And as we continue to use technology platforms that help us create this centralized database of our third parties with great information attached to it, the use of analytics, AI, et cetera, will help with the monitoring process. I don't know if you guys, Adam, you want to add anything to that one?
Yeah, I think just from a monitoring perspective, a lot of our clients struggle with, what's enough from a monitoring perspective, and we always kind of help them think through, taking a risk-based approach, right? So you don't want to monitor every single one of your third parties. Obviously, you want to look at the highest risk, the most critical third parties from a risk perspective, and put the appropriate monitoring activities and due diligence on those third parties. So whether that's through automated means using some of the new technologies that are out there, stuff like BitSight or Security Scorecard or some of those other vendors that are providing some data feeds into the security posture of your third parties. And that's one way to monitor. There's other ways to just periodically do risk assessments or validate controls. But always take a risk-based approach and don't try and boil the ocean and do too much for the third parties that aren't really the most highest risk to your organization.
Great. So thanks for that, Adam. So we're going to move to the fifth step, which is collaboration. And really what we want to talk about here, the first question on our slide, are the appropriate people connected to the third-party risk program? So again, this concept of reaching across the aisle within your organization, trying to create a collaborative culture around third parties and really sharing information. You can learn a lot from talking to various people within your company that do manage third parties. So, there is this opportunity to really look at the top of the funnel, to look at everyone that you're engaging with, kind of break this down by relationship type, perform the various risk assessments that have to be done, also include performance management. All of these third parties obviously have, obligations to you as a customer to providing a service or performing a service on your behalf. And really having all that information in a central location. The other cost-saving opportunity there is what we found when you go from various functional area to functional area within an organization that's engaging with third parties. A lot of times we find different technologies that are being used to handle the onboarding risk assessment, ongoing monitoring of those third parties. So again, just think about the opportunity to try and collapse that onto one platform, which can be done, and to have all that information in one location. So we really see an opportunity there. So again, the opportunities that we see around third-party risk management, taking this strategic approach. The other opportunity that we see within life sciences around knowing your third party is perhaps the opportunity to create an industry consortium where you can get agreement on a DDQ and how to really onboard and assess third parties. We're all using the same or similar third parties. So is there an opportunity to create this hub and spoke model where there's a consortium of life sciences manufacturers that can agree upon the various questions based on the relationship type and have that third party fill that out once and have an entity manage that and have the manufacturers pay for that information on an annual basis, but there's going to be a cost savings there because it'll be done once with the third party, go into the hub, and then the spokes will be able to access all that information. So it's been done in other industries. Actually, I can ask Mark maybe to provide a little more feedback on that. So it has not been done from what we can tell right now in life sciences.
Yeah, not yet in life sciences, but we have seen it in other industries. There's a consortium in the technology space where a number of technology companies are working together in a hub and spoke model, specifically around DDQ, sanction screening, political exposure, state ownership, negative news, so that they can do what I'd call basic hygiene kind of vetting around the third parties they're working with, which everyone has to do. It's sort of a baseline evaluation, and then that information is shared. There's, I think, 6 companies in the consortium, and they're all rather large. One of the things we've discovered is that in order to take advantage of a consortium, which everybody that hears it in every industry says, yes, that makes sense. We're all asking the same questions of the same third parties. That's a little silly. So I would say that the important thing there is to make sure you have your internal house in order. So having your internal house in order, meaning we have our own third part, we can harvest the demand within our company. We know who our third parties are. We've set up our risk dimensions. We've engaged our internal constituents. We've done the collaboration thing that you've mentioned about. It puts us in a place where we can take advantage of a consortium. We've also seen consortiums. There's one in the financial services market place around vendor management, where a lot of the participants are just not consuming that information that's being collected and shared because they don't have their house in order. So I think that's part of it as well. But if this life sciences space follows the same progression we've seen in other spaces over time, they'll sort of get their own internal house in order, get their constituents collaborating, figure out an effective third-party risk model, then make it more efficient is sort of step 2. Like, how do we get people out of this and make data a little bit more transparent, and then leverage a consortium? It becomes sort of a natural next step in trying to gain greater efficiencies.
Yeah, great. So the other opportunity that we see, again, is, taking this strategic enterprise approach is again, from a technology perspective. So, really pulling everyone together and consolidating the technology platform. So again, the benefits, potential benefits could be decreasing the cost of the platform. There's a benefit to really get that enterprise view of what your third-party risk is, and also putting in a process around performance management, leveraging the technology, and you're going to have a central repository of the third parties, which leads to our last bullet, which is around as you gather and collect all of this information, there's an opportunity to apply analytics to really provide some insights back to the business. So, that's really where, we see third-party risk management going. And there's an opportunity for, a number of organizations to take advantage of this in life sciences.
Yep. And folks, I want to apologize. We had a technical issue there for a second, so we have some comments on folks not seeing the screens for a minute or two. So we have resolved that. So hopefully everyone is seeing the screens again. And yes, a copy of the slides will be provided after the webinar. So thank you for your patience.
Great. Are we ready for questions in the panel? Okay. Thanks, Lisa. It was insightful. Just a question for the audience, and we'll start with you, Lisa. How mature would you say this third-party management discipline is in life sciences?
I would say that there's around onboarding and vetting healthcare professionals, mature, right? So there's some checks that have to be done with the HCPs that you're engaging. I think with TPIs, when you start to look at third parties, fourth parties, there's still work that has to be done. So I what we've seen again is that typical when we ask questions around what is your universe of third parties, 9 times out of 10, the number that we get versus what's really there, they'll never match up. So, I would say it's evolving. It's definitely not mature.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and for a question for Adam. Adam, this driver that we see in the space around GDPR, is this considered sort of a discipline that's owned by InfoSec, or because we've seen a little scrambling, like we know GDPR is coming and it's practically here, and supposedly there are big fines for those who don't comply, and we're not ready, and it's always a little unclear who owns it. From what you've seen, Adam, is this something that is the responsibility of the InfoSec team, or is it a separate group within the firm?
Yeah, that's a question that comes up all the time, Mark, quite honestly, and it really does depend upon your organization. Generally, there's one of 4 groups actually that own GDPR, and it will be pretty much dependent on how your organization is structured. But InfoSec is definitely always going to be involved, whether or not they actually own the process or not. They may or may not. But definitely from a data protection perspective, they are going to be involved and expanding probably upon what they traditionally do for their third-party assessments as it relates just to security. Expanding that to include additional privacy requirements is something that the information security group is doing. The privacy group, so the chief privacy officer and the privacy organization will also be the ones driving a lot of the policies. So the information security will a lot of times be the ones that are actually the operational arm of doing those assessments and identifying what the risk is within those third parties. But the privacy organization or the general counsel legal group will be actually providing those requirements. Also, we have seen that some of the organizations, the compliance organization, will own GDPR. So it's any of those kind of 4 players, whether it's compliance, legal, information security, or some of the larger organizations will have a dedicated privacy group. I haven't seen that as much with some of the life science organizations that I've worked with. It's mostly defaulted to information security, but as GDPR requires, you do need a data protection officer. You do need some sort of privacy organization that's setting those policies. So we're either kind of deferring that to the legal group or standing up a dedicated privacy organization.
Got it. And how about M&A? So from what I've seen from some, what I would say fatigued folks in life sciences firms, they just begin to almost see light at the end of the tunnel, and then there's another acquisition, and they're buried again and stuck digging out. I guess it sort of begs the question: how do we get on top of our game if the game itself is constantly changing? I would just ask Lisa if you have any insights into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with all the M&A that's happening as it relates to third parties, obviously there needs to be a robust process in place as you go through the due diligence and looking at that company, so you really understand who you're dealing with from a third party perspective. But onboarding and getting those third parties integrated into your program is also a challenge. So I think it's got to be part of that integration playbook. And a lot of times, I don't think it's as robust or detailed as it needs to be.
Are companies good at it, or is it just something that comes out of left field and shocks everybody?
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking back to my point earlier. I think processes are defined at a certain level. I think when it comes to following them through is what needs to be worked upon, right? So, for example, inventory, knowing your data, we can't just hand that over to a part of the organization and expect everything to be done and followed, right? There are times when the corporate can define a certain process, but it also needs the business to take a lead from the process and stay true to it, right? I can't be going and running off with my own set of process and engage with corporate or something that's defined at the enterprise level only when I absolutely feel like doing that. It needs to be enforced at a certain level. I always encourage my clients to look at it in three perspectives, right? So there's a top management, there is a middle sort of an interactive layer, and then there is the business layer, which is actually executing on the process. So the middle layer is the most important, where whatever has been defined at a corporate level needs to be enforced, and you can't really enforce it unless the business can receive that enforcement and apply it in the process. So the second layer is where it's important to kind of put those processes into action and try and align the process. The more we do that, the better our risk-making decisions will be, the better our decision-making process will be, and the more informed we will be in terms of managing the risks with third parties.
And I think also with M&A, Mark, just going back to one of your opening comments around master data management, I mean, it comes down to a data exercise, right, when you're going through this. So trying to, again, take a look at, again, the company that's being acquired,
right,
or the third parties that you're working with. Again, you're going to have overlap. So, how do we, do that merge? Are they active? Are they not? So, and really having, again, as part of your integration playbook, a good process for going through that and rationalizing that information.
Yeah, I'd say a place where companies tend to be fairly good at this is in supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
So company A acquires company B. Company A is set up. They have a team of sourcing people. They dig in right away. Let's analyze the spend. Let's run it through the machine. How much are we spending? Where are we spending it? With whom? Where are there contracts that are duplicative? Which one is better? Let's retire one and go to the other. And they tend to be very operationally focused and data focused in executing on supply chain, which tends to be cost savings as a driver, and they're trying to realize some of those synergies that were often put on the table when the merger was initially announced. The other discipline we see in supply chain that in more mature risk management organization tends to come out over time is this business of measurement. So I think supply chain being a fairly mature discipline, and when I say supply chain, I really mean like sourcing and procurement. They tend to be very good at metrics. So an effective supply management organization will set up metrics by which they're measured. They're very black and white. They're typically auditable. So when we say we save money, did we really save it? It audit trails back at the line level to invoices somewhere. And I think that same discipline is exercised at the very best risk managers in non-fin services firms outside of supply chain. And they tend to be fairly good at it. And the concept there is to answer the question, is everything we're doing around managing performance and managing supplier risk and all of this, right? I get we have to check boxes and we have to satisfy regulators. Is it actually helping? Can you show me metrics that show we're really building a more resilient company that's worth more in the public markets, that bounces back faster when a risk event occurs or sidesteps risk events that competitors might not avoid? And I would just say that I think is an important one, is early in the process to set up metrics, whether you publish them or not, but just for your own benefit. To kind of measure how are we doing, because eventually this could cost the firm a lot of money. There's expense tied up in this thing, and we have to somehow connect that to benefit that the firm receives. Otherwise, we're perpetually in this place where we're budget starved. They only want to give us enough money to just barely meet the minimum and not actually do a good job at it.
Right. I think the one area where we've seen some challenges is around just globally. So, and around the TPIs that you engage with. So, and part of that goes back to one of Dick's points. You may have a corporate policy in place for how to engage with TPIs and a whole process to onboard and risk assess. But when you operationalize that down into your markets, sometimes we see very decentralized programs, and it may be handled very differently.
Are decentralized programs bad?
Not necessarily.
Because I wouldn't think so.
No, it's not. It really depends on the way the business is structured. Yeah, sometimes you could have like a centralized, decentralized, or a federated model, and Adam can speak to that in more detail. But technically, it's the way the business works better, and you don't want to be a bottleneck to a certain thing that works better if it's decentralized, right?
I think my only comment to that, I agree, but the one thing that you have to watch is when you have remediation steps. So for a certain risk profile, you want it to be consistent globally.
Yes.
So as you push that out and
yes.
you centralize it, you have to have a way of making sure
Agreed.
that everyone's following.
Agreed. Yeah.
Almost like a hub and spoke model.
Yeah.
Hub and spoke model. You define the baselines, and then you let the businesses kind of, use those baselines and build on it.
Yeah.
Right. So as long as you have that, it's pretty open in terms of what the managing structure looks like, whether it's decentralized. As long as the common baselines are everyone speaking the same language, it's just more easier to kind of manage the risks around it.
I think it's theoretically good. It's hard.
Yes.
Practically, to see, again.
I would think of it as a blocking and tackling approach, right? If company A is acquiring company B, keep them isolated, and let's catch our breath. Let's let things settle out in the acquisition, then get them integrated. But meanwhile, just hold them accountable.
Yeah.
These are our standards for risk management. These are the risk domains, and so on. And let them go ahead and manage it. You won't drive a ton of costs out of the organization,
right.
But you'll always be managing risk.
But as long as it's on your list, so you can put it into your 100-day plan and then figure out when it's going to happen. So, yeah.
How about in the InfoSec space, Adam? One of the things, we have a question here from the audience, and by the way, for everyone's benefit in the audience, you can ask questions using the chat feature on the GoToWebinar panel. But in InfoSec, I think it's a little bit of a different type of risk in that it's being seen as an existential threat. Would you concur with that? Do you think your clients in life sciences are seeing it that way?
Seeing information security threats as what? I missed part of that part.
Existential risk. Sorry if the phone beeped when we were talking about that. As opposed to sort of a check the box, we need to do this to make regulators happy. This InfoSec risk really could sink the firm and has the attention of the leadership team and has unique ability to get funding and resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is where the media kind of helps us out a little bit, right? So we've seen a lot of different examples, hit the news where there's been some data breaches, some high-profile data breaches that have been caused by third parties, right? And that's why we see all the attention, from auditors and regulators that continuously focus on this third-party risk, right? And around how are you making sure that your third parties are handling your data appropriately, have the proper controls in place to actually protect that data when it's being processed or it's being shared in some manner. So, there's a lot of examples from just the retail space, obviously, like the Targets, the Home Depots, which we've all heard of over the years. But it is affecting life science. There was Boston Medical Center, the Medical Informatics Engineering Group. There was some high-profile cases where EPA electronic health records were actually compromised. So that kind of helps actually get the attention on information security, and I think it's the main driver that we see, across all of our clients. Obviously financial risk and compliance risk, those things are out there, but the main driver really is, we need to protect our data. That's where the fines are going to come from. That's where we're going to get a lot of public embarrassment if we have an issue. So, information security is definitely the driver that's really getting the most attention, the most funding to really make sure that we've got the proper controls in place at all of our third parties. And then, as you mentioned, downstream, making sure that our third parties have programs in place that actually manage their third parties, which would be our fourth parties. I don't know, Vic, if you want to add anything more to that from an InfoSec perspective.
No, I think you covered it all, Adam. That's precisely the challenges that at least I've seen in my experience as well with all the clients that I've been working with. So I think.
And you do these risk assessments for your clients, right?
Oh yeah. I'm actively doing one right now, and I'm seeing these challenges as we speak. So we're helping them fix it at the same time. There's so many variables in this to make it work, because sometimes there could be a piece of the organization. So let's say a business wants to get its application certified. The IT has its own processes, or at the corporate level you have some processes, but the business doesn't necessarily follow all of these. So you can't really set up in a separate security organization just for one application or one business. You have to work together.
Right.
And I think that's the message that the second layer that I mentioned earlier, that's kind of the key role that connects the dots. So we're helping them figure that piece out. Again, the governance structure, the operating model, all of those components go in to make sure that the pieces are tied together, and the organization is working in one.
And in that domain, so I recognize things like technology firms were early adopters of web technologies, cloud technologies. All of those things bring exposure because of the fact that anybody can type in www and get to a site. Would you say the InfoSec discipline is mature in life science? Like, are they using a control framework, or is it questionnaire based, or what are you seeing?
That's a great point, but again, it varies, right? So, for example, this may sound a little bit technical, but if you are, let's say you've outsourced to a cloud service provider where your data is being stored, I don't know if you actually go in and check if there's data commingling happening at a server layer, wherever it's been stored. Commingling, or it's basically either you could have dedicated servers with dedicated drives that they don't really share with any other party. Yeah. Or you could have it in the cloud somewhere where there could be data from other companies as well. So what you have to do is be very careful about if there is a provider coming in with a very cheap service and very low cost sort of a service, you might want to look into those details and bring in your technology experts to ask the right questions, because if that could
secure environment is costly.
Yeah. So if there is a breach at another party, that eventually could mingle with the data where your data could be stored. So you don't want to get into that kind of an issue.
Got it. Do they use control frameworks as far as you could?
They do for now. I think cloud security frameworks, there are plenty of them that are out there. It really depends on how aware are the organizations out there, and are they using those frameworks to manage the risks.
Got it. Time for one last question, and the one that comes to the top is around Europe versus North America. So would you say Europe is ahead of or behind North America in data privacy and information security, those aspects?
Well, thank you, Mark, for putting me on the spot. But I would really say it depends on where you are in your maturity curve. We see a lot of adoption of standards.
Firm specific.
It's firm specific. It's also, the standards vary. So if you're a firm that's completely based out of the U.S. regions, right, you would focus on more like the NIST standards, National Institute of Standards and Technologies. ISO is more global. So if you have presence globally, you'll see a lot of European firms trying to align with the ISO standards. You may have the best of both breeds. You may have your own framework where you will say, okay, well, I want to use the best of NIST, I want to use the best of ISO, and here is my baseline set of rationalized control framework, which, by the way, we help a lot of our clients kind of help define that. That helps them kind of show the crosswalk between NIST and ISO and several other standards. And those are just standards. You could also include regulations and your leading practices, your own internal policies as well, right? So if you write a policy and you say you're doing something and you're not doing it, you're in non-compliance.
Right.
So auditors are going to find that out. So it doesn't mean that you just write a policy and then you forget about it and you say, oh, by the way, I'm compliant to ISO or NIST, but you have to comply with your internal policies as well. So it's a rationalized set of requirements library that every organization should think about, setting that up as the baseline and let the business kind of take the lead from there and define their own operating processes around those controls.
Got it. And our last question comes from James. Adam, I'll direct this to you and the question is, how do you feel about the use of SOC 2 Type 2 reports to ensure that the right security controls, processes, procedures are in place? We get this question a lot, but...
Yep, we get this question a lot, and generally it certainly is acceptable. The one thing that you need to look at is, does the SOC 2 report actually cover off on the business processes that you're outsourcing to that particular third party? a lot of times you'll just get a general report. It may or may not, or maybe partially is applicable to what the service that is actually being provided by that third party. So you really need to look at it. A lot of my clients who have gone down that path and accepted kind of SOC 2 reports have tried to do a crosswalk between what's in the SOC 2 report against their requirements, and a lot of them have just bailed on it, to be honest with you, just because it takes a lot of time to go through it, and it's more efficient for them just to send out their questionnaire or send out their requirements and get feedback from the third party around those specific requirements versus taking a standardized document and then trying to correlate that to making sure it covers off on everything that meets your policies and standards. So it's certainly something you can do to save time, but you just need to be careful that it's actually covering off on what you need it to cover off on.
Great. Well, listen, we're at the top of the hour, so I want to thank our panelists, Vic, Adam, Lisa. Very much appreciate your time and participation today. It was a good, insightful topic. For our audience, I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all the questions, but we do have a list of those that were submitted, and for those that we weren't able to address online here, we'll respond to you privately, and the slides will be made available to the audience.
Yes, thanks everybody for coming, and we'll respond with the slides and the answers as Mark said. So everyone have a terrific day. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
All
Bye.
Right, bye-bye.
Thank you.